Welcome to our vibrant network of governance, risk, compliance, and cybersecurity leaders. We share cutting-edge insights, best practices, and innovative strategies to empower professionals in navigating the dynamic cyber threat landscape. Join Circulo de CISO to ignite resilience and data protection across industries.
We are discussing API security. And APIs are becoming more popular, and Vaithi in his first episode mentioned that 83% of the internet traffic is generated through APIs. $43 billion lost due to cyber crimes. So to continue this discussion, Vaithi, what are common API security risks? Vaithi?
Thanks, Sujit. Right. So, to any traditional application risk assessment that we do, two common risks that we actually start looking at is one is authentication, other is authorization. Right. So, both of these risks would also apply to an API security. Right. So, when we talk about API authorization, the API endpoints, if they are not configured correctly, or if there's a broken authorization in the API endpoint, then it would allow a user to actually log in and see another user's data. For example, like say if Sujit logs in and he can still see what Vaithi has done as a part of his transactions. The reason why I say authorization authentication is all the more important is because 4 out of 5 times, all of the attacks that happens on API is because of these poorly configured authentication authorization, right? So it's very important. Authorization is also all the more important because of the GDPR regulations as well. Because the moment you actually see another person's personal information, then it becomes a compliance issue as well, right? And as far as authentication is concerned, see to it that your endpoints have OAuth implemented. Right? If that is not there, then it becomes an open channel for the hackers to actually get in and then do whatever they want in terms of accessing the application. So these two are like critical risk, which is also being noted as top 2 risk in the OAS top 10 API security risk. So it's important as like say CISOs or the development teams or security teams to actually focus on how they actually build the authorization and the authentication to these APIs. The third point, one of the biggest headaches for CISO, I think we discussed earlier as well, is maintenance of an API inventory, right? Most of the organization, not just BFSI, but even other organizations would find it very difficult to actually maintain APIs. The very reason is they had not started kind of recording them at the time when they actually started their enterprise. So as and when they grow bigger, it becomes all the more complex to actually maintain this inventory. One of the reasons why CISOs or security practitioners insist that API inventory needs to be maintained is for the particular reason you need to know what version of your APIs are actually running in production. Because if you have an API which you have not deprecated and you're not using, then that becomes an actual open listening channel for your hackers to understand what is happening in the application. So it becomes all the more important imperative for organizations to see to it that they maintain a clear list of API inventories, like what are all the active APIs that are running, what are all the APIs that are being deprecated, is it actually being deprecated, and do that. So for doing that, ensure that you test your APIs for vulnerabilities quite frequently. It could be like, say, every time you bring a new API, depending on the complexity of your organization, or at least once in every quarter, see to it that you actually kind of go and review your API inventory and see whether your API versioning is done properly and you have all your current set of active APIs there and all your APIs which are not being used are deprecated appropriately. Right? So that is something that another important aspect from a risk standpoint. The third important point is rate limiting, throttling, they call it, right? And this is all the more important these days because we see a lot of DDoS attack, denial of service attacks that are happening via the APIs. right? So because as I said, now most of the APIs are public APIs, so you have a lot of external customers or corporates who actually log into your portal and then doing transactions and stuff like that. So that gives rise to a malicious actor also kind of getting in and then doing a DOS attack or a DDoS attack. So I think in preventing, or rather at least to some extent stopping this from occurring, we need to have, like, say, a rate limiting or a throttling configured at every API endpoint, just to ensure that we actually put a stop on the number of requests that can come from a particular IP, right? And there where risk assessment comes in. So you just need to look at for which client you're going to kind of implement this rate limiting or a throttling control and all of that, right? So this also becomes a very important factor. And the other point is on the excessive data exposure that happens, particularly when you actually expose more of your data at a client side, right? So it's important that developers ensure that all of these data is actually kind of relate at a server side and on a client side. You don't expose all of your data to your client, and is all the more having an impact from a compliance perspective also, is how much data you actually expose, right? Because if you look at today's world, right, the number of actors that comes into a play when a fintech actually gets in, like, say, it could be banks primarily. You have integration with a lot of banks, you need a lot of APIs. Secondly, you integrate with a lot of clients as well. So, and you integrate with a lot of third parties as well, right? Because you kind of have like, say, microservices, you're on cloud and you have to interact with a lot of cloud service providers, banks and vendors and all of that. So you need to be absolutely clear when you actually interact with these clients, to have certain standards in place, or have a standard for your organization from an API perspective, and say, hey, this is what I actually want you to be having. Because sometimes what happens is, again, going back to that word of urgency, we sometimes tend to kind of take a back seat in terms of discussing these factors, and eventually these becomes a talking point, especially at a time when a breach happens. Why wasn't this discussed, and what was the third party risk management team doing, and all of these things, right? So it becomes all the more important that from an API standpoint, these 4 or 5 aspects that we were talking about on authentication, authorization, excessive data exposure, rate limiting, all these factors are actually taken into consideration, especially at the time of developing the APIs. Over to you, sir.
Vaithi, I mean, very nicely clarified that. So you had about 6 or 7 points you emphasized on, and your last 2 points were standards. You have to have an API standards which the organization would adopt. And then you also talked briefly about the third-party risk. But there is this perception, right? A lot of people think and assume that having an API manager will solve all these points you mentioned: authentication, authorization, excessive data exposure, rate limiting, inventory. Is that true?
Absolutely. It depends on how far your organization is willing to spend that much on having an API manager. But this role is very crucial, as you said. I mean, this could be the next JD that we may have to prepare for a role,
Okay.
because especially for fintechs, right, with the number of APIs that we are developing and the number of integrations that we are having with our partners, right? And just going back on the API standards, right? It's not about just having a document in place. Right? So now with DevOps, DevSecOps, and kind of going berserk. So we just need to ensure that these standards are embedded in the pipeline stage itself. So as and when an API is developed, see to it that these are actually embedded into your product, right? And it also kind of increases the security posture of your company as well.
Vaithi, I have one last question for this episode. You did mention that 83% of the traffic is from API. But when you look at the cybercrime numbers, it is staggering 43 billion, right? So if it is so heavily targeted by the adversaries, why are people still using APIs?
Because of the ease of use and to kind of better integrate with applications, right? So, and faster transfer of data and getting things done. And that's one of the primary usage. So we cannot just kind of say that something is risky and then kind of step back. So we just need to see how far we kind of secure that channel and see to it that we have good value that is getting derived out of these new technologies coming in. So that's my take on it.
All right. So if I were to restate what you said, what you're saying is it provides ease of implementation and data transfer, whilst it is the responsibility of the development team, the risk management team, compliance team to adhere to the best practices. So define the API standards for the organizations to practice, continuously do a risk assessment. If there are updates to be done, you need to do the updates. If you need to deprecate the APIs, you need to do that. So you need to have a lifecycle management for APIs. And in order for you to do that, you need to have an inventory. And it is also important when we talk about authentication and authorization, we typically think authentication and authorization is only for the humans, where a human being is using a username and a password to type in and access the information. But here, this programming tool allows you to have access without intervention. And that has to be defined as well as to what exactly the data which should be transferred or retrieved. So that's where you're talking about excessive exposure of data. So people need to understand if it has PII data, then the privacy laws will be relevant for that. Right? So I guess this will give the viewers an idea in terms of what they need to do to better govern the API ecosystem. Vaithi, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sujit.
And viewers, we would like you to keep an eye on the next episode where we will be talking about the future trends in API economy as well as the API security. Right? So please watch out for those episodes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.